This week on the Read Well podcast, we're talking again with Dr. Martin Jacobs. He is a professor of composition, English, linguistics at Texas and A&M University. Don't know why that was so hard for me to say this morning, Dr. Jacobsen, but it came out just fine. This is his third time on the show, and I'm really happy to have him back. He's back by popular demand. People always message me about Dr. Jacobsen's episodes because we get into some really fun stuff. He has a very unique way of looking at reading and how to apply the concept of language and books and thinking to the habit of reading, which is a lot of fun. And we're going to actually talk about that today. Dr. Jacobsen set up a goal for himself this year to read 52 books, and we're going to see how that went for him. He seems to have some pros and some cons to share with us today, which I'm really excited about, because we talk a lot about the idea of setting reading goals, and how do you know how many books you should read, and should you be reading quickly, should you be reading slowly? So we're going to get into that today. I'm very excited about it. How you doing, Dr. Jacobsen?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Good. What have you been up to since we talked last?
Well, I made a trip to Carlsbad Caverns.
Oh.
And I haven't been there in 50 years, so it was an interesting thing to do. And
yeah, you're a nature guy, right? You like to get out and hike and see the world, and I love that. Yeah, I don't even know what Carlsbad Caverns is. What is that?
It's the biggest underground cavern in the U.S. It's in New Mexico.
Okay.
And it's a national park. It's a pretty famous kind of place. And I was there when I was a little kid. It was the first sort of vacation I remember going on with my parents. And so I took my son and we went and did it's like walking down 75 flights of stairs. That's how they put it. It's underground about 750 feet.
Wow.
And
are there lots of bats and stuff down there and random things?
Bats. Yeah, they do. Yeah. They're famous for their bats. They do have bats.
Yeah, it seems like a good place for the bats. Well, good. So let's get into this goal that you set for yourself. What made you want to read 52 books this past year?
Well, a former student of mine posted on Facebook that she had read 52 books in 2023.
Okay.
And it just became a goal at that moment. Like,
sure,
I didn't want to be a slacker compared to my former students, and so I set the goal, and then I started to strategize, and I think in most basic terms, it was kind of a false motive.
Oh, tell me about that.
I think that once I put a number on it, accomplishing the number became the goal, not reading the books.
Oh, I love that.
And so when I started to choose the books, I would choose by length mostly, which, and it worked. It worked like a charm to some degree, which it was a matter of... Go on.
You're not reading War and Peace on this.
No, I did not read War and Peace. I did read one 450 pager and one 550 pager, but
that's pretty. Yeah, okay.
I also read a couple of 50 pagers. And so I got some numbers. I did a fair number of rereads. I did about 11 rereads.
Was 1984 in that?
No, I reread that a couple of years ago, though.
Okay, I saw your comment on Facebook. I was like, oh, I love 1984. Anyway.
But I was already reading a couple of them for class and stuff, so I incorporated them. But the one that we might talk about later, Flowers for Algernon, I was teaching it at the time and rereading it at the time, so that's on the list. And it's a no man's land whether that's a fair addition to the list or not. I reread Old Man and the Sea, and it had been 30 years since I had read that. That's a different question than rereading something that I read last semester already. It's like, and I've reread Flowers for Algernon several times. I read 6 Days of the Condor. Do you know that book?
Yeah.
That's a reread, and that's one of my favorite movies is 3 Days of the Condor. So
Yeah.
I don't know if that counts. I reread Candide.
Absolutely.
So I mean, I looked at the book until I was done. I mean, that's reading, but I wonder if that's a fair. I wonder if that's a fair claim to say that I reread a book, so I put it on this list of books I'm trying to read.
100% it is. In fact, that's one of the things at least I advocate for is if a book is worth reading, it should probably be worth reading twice, right?
Yes.
Because we get something nice out of a book. Well, what I get when I read a book for the first time is like the scout who knows where the mountains and the valleys are. Like I know the landscape now, but I got to go back and travel that trail again to really pay attention to the berries on the trees,
Right.
smell the pine in the trees. I missed all of that because I was trying to figure out the map. And now the map's in my head. So absolutely, I think that's the first message for today, you guys, is to reread a book is just as valuable, in my opinion, even more valuable to read it a second time because now you can see the notes if you took notes the first time around, and you just get deeper. It means more. So yeah, absolutely, love it.
Okay. So that was one approach, and I did actually on the good side. I discovered a couple of authors that I liked quite a bit.
Oh, who do you got?
Julian Barnes. Have you ever read anything by Julian Barnes?
I have
He's a
not.
British author,
Yep.
and it's memoir esque. It's
Yep.
it's sort of like creative nonfiction almost. I mean, it's fictional. They're novels, and they have novel structures and that kind of thing. But and looking at the background, they're drawn from his direct experience. So it's
Mhm.
you know you can see when it's really authentic, and you can sort of even tell when it isn't. And that's kind of an
Right.
interesting thing. Um, I also read another book by Neil Gaiman, which I'm not. I had read a couple before, and this one was called "The Ocean at the End of the Lane."
Oh, okay.
It's a really short book, but it
Uh-huh.
was really interesting. It was sort of Harry Potterish, and I really liked that. Okay, I read Louise Erdrich, whom I'd never
Oh, yeah.
read before,
Yeah.
and her books were very difficult for
Yeah.
me because I share a lot of that kind of background from my very young days, and
Uh-huh.
so it was very familiar to me, and I'm from that part of the world kind of too, so I understood that. I read a couple of Willa Cather books that I'd never read. One
Uh-huh.
set in New Mexico, Death Comes for the Archbishop, which is kind of where I
Uh-huh.
live now, right? And then one set in Nebraska, which is where I grew up.
Uh-huh.
So
Uh-huh.
in the one that was set in Nebraska, I mean, the phrasing was even familiar to me. It had this kind of
Gary.
resonance to me. Eerie is not a bad word for that. And the way
Uh-huh.
neighbors act was very familiar to me, even though it was set over 100 years ago. Those notions are still sort of available to someone who grew up in Nebraska in the 60s and 70s, all the way up through the 90s. So um, I really liked reading those. I read a couple of books by John Dewey,
Oh,
which weren't inspirational
yeah.
exactly. His writing style's pretty
Yeah.
difficult, but I'd never read anything by John Dewey, and I see him all the time because I'm an educator. So I thought I'd get some. I read one about philosophy and one about education.
Yeah.
They were experience in education and reconstruction in philosophy.
Okay.
So I've got some John Dewey under my belt
Nice.
now.
Nice juicy reads, right?
Yeah. And I read two Dostoevsky's,
What'd you read?
Notes from Underground and The Landlady.
Yeah. Great books. Notes from the Underground is really where he started to find his footing as an author. Yeah. That's
Yeah.
a fantastic book.
And so those, I read more than one by all of those authors. I read two Stephen King books.
And what did you read from King?
I read Elevation,
Uh-huh.
which is a very short
Yeah.
book.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's weird enough to be him, but it's not terrifying in the way that a lot of his books can be.
Well, I don't know, but a lot of people don't know this about King, which they probably should, because he's one of the better selling authors. Is he doesn't write just horror too, right? He's in fantasy and sci-fi, and he's Western. He's all over the place.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And then I read a short story collection called Everything's Eventual.
Yeah. Who wrote that? I haven't.
Something I did with my daughter. I gave her a short story collection by Stephen King, and then she gave me one. And so and then we read both of them. And that was really interesting. And it had been a long time since I'd read any Stephen King, so I was glad to do that again.
You know, short stories have a special place in my heart. I more than anything, I love reading essays and short stories because they're so compact, right? And you can read them in one or two sittings. But an essay seems to really want to change the world if it's written well. And so you walk away with at least something to think about, like, wow,
Right.
that's really good. But a short story has a different style to it because they have to accomplish so much in such a short amount of time. I've been reading Flannery O'Connor's short stories, and
Sure.
A Good Man is Hard to Find, for example, that short story. If you haven't read that, everybody, go read A Good Man is Hard to Find.
Yeah, right now, after we're done.
It's very good. Well, that's exciting. If we were to back up a little bit, you said something I want to talk about, which is that the achieving the number of 52 books became more important than the actual reading. Walk me through the psychology of that, because I felt that too. I've set these goals before in my life, but what did you feel or experience?
Well, it's a little bit like your last guest, Dr. Wolf, said, and you were going to you made some kind of joke about making a T-shirt out of this phrase, and I think I became a great skimmer, right?
Yeah. He said, I'm a darn fine skimmer.
And it's weird, though. I mean, because based on the things that she did mention, you do see things when you skim that you may not quite get when you don't. So when I read One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, I skimmed a lot, but I was able to, I knew what to do because his style was sort of available. And it was through the skimming that I found out how he did things. He would build the main points into the end of paragraphs, and you could track things very easily. And there was a lot of dialogue in there, and the dialogue was really more of a keep you engaged kind of thing. And it didn't, it existed for itself. It wasn't necessarily integral to the narrative, the overall narrative. He just told you what he was talking about. But the dialogue was more of it was like the action of the book in some ways more than the meat of it.
Yeah.
So that was one instance where skimming might have sort of alerted me to something that I might not have seen if I hadn't done that. But I did do some speed reading, as it were. I did do some skimming, and I chose really short books to read. And that was another. I mean, it led to some books that I probably wouldn't have read otherwise. So I'm glad I did that. And I read a lot more recent books than I ever would have before, probably. Recent being within the last 25 years. Because I tend toward the older stories, the ancient stuff, even.
You're into the Divine Comedy and Plato and all of that stuff. Yeah. This is why we talk together a lot.
And I went to on Father's Day, I went to a space museum, an Air and Space Museum. It's called the Stafford Museum. It's in Oklahoma. So I read his biography before I went to the museum. So that it's a great thing that you can and I found it online. Yeah. I mean, they have this great thing out there called Internet Archive. It's got a lot of interesting things, and it's even got TV series, and now it's, I guess, whatever they can afford. I don't know, but this book was right there. It was really fun to read. And on that note, I read 46 fiction books.
Okay.
6 philosophy books, 2 nonfiction, and 1 memoir. The Rocket Boys. By Homer Hickam. Do you know the movie October Sky? So that was a very inspirational book to me for lots of different reasons. But and And I got 25 books from the local libraries or my
Okay.
work library.
I like the
15,
data here.
yeah, I owned 15 of them already. 8 online, 4 Kindle, 2 audio, which I didn't like that much, and 1 that I borrowed from somebody. I had some driving that I had to do, so I did an audio book while I was
Yeah.
driving.
Yeah.
But I mean, while it made use of the time, that became the motive. And it was The Postman Rings Twice was one of the books that I read on audio, and another one was a new one, The Cabin at the End of the Train,
And
which
okay.
was it's an odd book.
Yeah.
It's mostly about generations talking to each other about things. Yeah. So
Okay.
yeah,
So what I like about this conversation so far is that one, I love the data. I love that you tracked it. One of the things I love to talk about is that reading actually is a skill. You and I have talked about this. Dr. Wolf talked about this. And you're a linguistics guy. You like to break down sentence structure and figure out why sentences work, why they don't. Dr. Wolf talked about how our brains are not designed to read. We weren't born wired to do that because reading is an invention that we created. Our
right,
brains were wired to see food. Our brains were wired to sort of judge the situation and realize, oh, I'm hot, I'm cold, I don't feel good. But the act of sitting down and reading a book like Flowers for Algernon, this is we weren't born for this. So because we invented this, we literally create new synaptic connections in our brains to do this. And so we change, right? We become better. And so I love what you're talking about in terms of trying to set a reading goal for yourself, and the fact that you're paying attention to not just the fact that you read books, but how you did it. I read some fiction, some nonfiction. These are the methods. That's really good because it helps. I think it helps you realize what works best for you because
right.
I think that's important. Um, the way that you consume books in whatever setting is going to work better for you than it might for me in other situations. Don't you think? Like we're all a little
Yes,
different. Yeah.
yes, I do.
And that's okay, isn't it? Like, I know there's a lot of science behind, well, you should do it this way or that way, but some of us do better with audiobooks, and that's fine. Some of us do better with paper books. That's fine. I'm a paper book guy. I would much rather sit with a paper book. But I think it all counts as reading, doesn't it?
I do. And I've had a couple of books that I've really needed an audio to get through.
Yeah.
I just
Well, that
stalled,
that's
a couple of times.
That's a good point too, because we have not only am I a unique person that consumes information a certain way, but depending on what I'm consuming dictates the form it needs to take. Because there are certain books, there is no way I could read it on paper. I have to hear it. It has to be read to me because it's not going to be, something I'm going to get through. And for me, I actually prefer listening to fiction audiobooks, especially now because the production's so dang good. They've got like sound effects. There are 7 voice actors, and it's so like consuming. Stephen King books are fun to listen to, for
I
example.
bet that's true. I've never listened to one, but I bet that's true.
They're a blast. Yeah, they're a blast. So okay, I love that. But we both seem to be pretty ambitious guys, and so when I've set my goals, I have found that if I get behind by a day, I start to stress because I'm missing my 52 book goal, right?
Right.
And so now it's like all day long I feel anxiety because I didn't do my reading for that morning. So now reading becomes a chore for me, it becomes a weight. And so I start finding ways to maybe cheat the system is the wrong way to say it, but cheat the system so that I can still hit my goal. You mentioned reading shorter books, but did you ever feel any of that pressure?
I did. And if I missed a day or if I ran into a book that I didn't like, which there
Mm.
were 1 or 2 that I didn't like very much, and I would procrastinate, then I had the guilt of procrastinating and
Yes.
the pressure of making up the lost the lost effort.
Yeah.
And I was tracking everything and how many I read a month and all this kind of thing. And some of them were, like I said, were short. And I mean, they've got an ISBN and covers, so they
And
qualify as a book, but in another setting, it might be a short story. So one of them was called "The Grown Up" by Gillian Flynn, and it's a Stephen King-esque kind of
yeah, she's a dark
book. It's a
writer. Yeah.
good Halloween book, Joey. If you want a
Yeah.
Halloween book, it's a good Halloween book. But really, it was like 50 pages long, and calling that a book, I mean,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah. Sure.
technically true, but I'm not sure. I mean, if it were in a collection of other things, it wouldn't be a book, right? I mean,
Well,
what
yeah.
we
Yeah.
call a book, I mean, that's a big question too, is what constitutes a book.
Yeah, here's one of the things that I struggle with. I think one of the reasons why I started the channel because I was feeling overwhelmed as a reader. I'd go on YouTube and I'd see people with like they have these pictures of themselves with like a bunch of books. Like I read all these books this month or whatever. There's like 80 books. I don't know. And there's a big movement right now to sort of value yourself as a human and as an intellectual by the number of books that you read,
Mhm.
right? And so they're creating these videos of how to read 100 books in a month and remember everything. Well, right out of the gate, I know that's not true. It's like that's not possible. You might be able to read 100 books if that's all you did, right? Like you had
Right.
no kid, no job, no responsibilities. You lived in your mother's basement, and you literally did it just to create an interesting YouTube channel. Maybe you could do that, but you're definitely not remembering everything unless you are a savant with a photographic memory. So these videos really bother me. They're really kind of they made me feel bad about myself. I'm like, what am I broken? I'm only reading, I don't know, 4, 5, 10 books a quarter or a year sometimes because I'm really busy. I got kids and everything. Um, people ask me all the time how many books I read. I probably read maybe 20 books a year. That's roughly where I'm at, Um, and but that I don't think that really matters. Some years I read 3 books, but man, I read those books.
Mhm.
Like I am deep in note taking, and I am loving every second of it. So I think that's what sort of caused this channel was I was feeling some of those emotional feelings you were talking about. That there's guilt that comes with reading, and there's anxiety, and I don't think that stuff should be present. Reading should be something that makes your life better. And the moment you feel guilty or anxious about this habit, something's wrong. I would argue something's off with your motivation a little bit here. You know,
I think that was certainly true for me in this particular enterprise. I think that again, my choices were sometimes a little iffy, and um, but again, I mean, if you can find an edition of something that's got its own covers,
yeah,
you can put it on the list. I mean, they are products, right?
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
you know,
yeah,
and um, so that's was a trouble. That was troublesome to me. That you know, I was trying to justify, or I was trying to.
I
I,
love it.
I hate this word, but contrived is kind of the word I'm coming up with. I was contriving the accomplishment in a way that it didn't feel like an accomplishment.
Yeah,
And I put a lot of effort into making it go rather than reading the books. And
yeah, yeah. I get a chance every now and then because of the YouTube channel and the podcast to sort of connect with other creators who are doing these. They have a different methodology of reading. Like again, for me, it's about reading slowly, taking notes, applying the ideas. That's sort of what I love. But they kind of open up the scenes, or at least open up themselves behind the scenes to say how they're doing this. And oftentimes they're not even skimming the book. They're going to Spark Notes and they're reading like the paragraphs of the description and saying, "Okay, I read that book." Right? Um, I hate to tell you this, guys, but if you read the Spark Notes or the book blurb of War and Peace, you didn't read War and Peace. you,
right,
you missed all of it. um, but we're in an age now where we feel like information needs to come quicker in small sound bites, and that is sufficient. It's interesting. Apple News just put out an essay yesterday about how kids with advanced college degrees are no longer able to read books.
Right. I saw it too.
Did you?
I
Okay,
think
yeah.
I did.
So
Yes.
this was a great essay. And the summary of this was that it's not that they don't want to read books. It's that they literally don't know how, because they have not been asked to complete a full book in high school or even junior high. Instead, their teachers are giving them small snippets of things, lots of links on the internet. Read this chapter of War and Peace, and then we'll discuss it. Or, read this one short story from Flannery O'Connor, and now you know everything about Flannery O'Connor, right? And they're missing the bigger picture of the whole thing. And so now when people go to read books, because I think we want to read books. I think we're all tired of going 1,000 miles an hour, but we literally don't know how anymore. We've lost that ability. And it feels really good to sit down and read slowly and read a whole book for what it is. There's a great book called 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals by Oliver Burkeman. And he makes the argument that tasks have time baked into them. You can't change how long something takes, right? To read a book well takes a certain amount of time. Like, you've been reading The Republic by Plato for years and years and years.
Right.
Guess what? That book demands that. It's not a quick read. And you'll probably read it for 40 years. Because that's how much time is baked into that, right?
Right.
You can't rush it. You can't. And so I think once we accept that for ourselves, something inside of us goes, this feels really good. I'm slowing down. I'm allowing myself to slow down and pay attention to this thing. I don't know. What are your thoughts with all that?
It wasn't that long ago. Probably the fact for my parents was probably that if you wanted to know something, you got the book. And you read it, I mean, it wasn't just a way of entertaining. It was a way of learning. It was a way of doing something different or new or what have you. And you had to take in the entire book to get what you wanted out of it. Then we got TV and sound bites and memes and reels, and it's difficult to find a complete idea anywhere. I mean, it's kind of a little unusual, but I kind of have an interest in knots. Knot tying ever since I was a Boy Scout.
Sure.
And I see these reels and they don't even tell you what they did. They just stir their hands around and this knot comes out, but you don't know what it is. You don't know what it's for. They don't explain anything. Right. And the whole idea of a book for my parents, I think, would have been, this is going to tell me everything I need to know, that there was a comprehensive outcome for reading something. Okay. But now there's almost an assumption that it's going to be over soon. And that's what's happening to these kids who haven't ever read a book when they go to college.
Yeah.
Is that they don't think about spending that kind of time. And I think it's partially because they've never gotten a reward for it. And the only reward for it is that you know what the book said, right?
Yeah.
That you got what you were supposed to get from, or that the process of reading the book was good, that you learned how to read something. So something Dr. Wolf was talking about too, is a very big idea, and it's been stirring around up here since I watched listened to that podcast, is the zone of proximal development. And we're not just getting what the book says. I mean, we learn how to read every time we read something. And a harder book over here might not be the content in a book. It might be our experience with reading books that makes that possible or not. I mean, we don't read any books. I mean, it makes a lot of things impossible for like, these students in the Ivy League school never read a novel. I mean, that's just so
crazy
outside my thought process. But it's out there fast. We want to do things fast. And I think, like Dr. Wolf also said, and I wrote about this a little bit in my dissertation all those years ago. If it's electronic, you assume you need to read it faster. That, the medium is the message to some degree, right?
Yeah.
And when I was writing my dissertation, I wrote about how hypertext environments are a lot different than books.
Mm-hmm.
And that literacy was really kind of a lousy preparation for hypertext environments because
Uh-huh.
they don't work the same way and nothing is sustained. The whole idea is that you click the next link. And whether you mean to or not, it's like a speech act. You almost have to respond to a link that's
Yeah.
there. Something one day and this was back in the 90s when people didn't know, a lot of people didn't have internet in their homes. They didn't have cable modems. They were dialing up, and it was very prohibitive to actually engage this. And I was in this browser, and of course, back then, a different browser was an entirely different reading experience because they didn't show you the same things the same way.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, it was really strange. And so I had this browser open, and there was a page there, and then on top of that page was something else, and within that was a video. And it hit me at that moment that this wasn't possible 50 years ago, that
Yeah.
having all these things in the same kind of mental space was not available to this concept didn't exist 50 years ago. And here I am, I'm looking, I don't even know how to get back. They call it hyperstructure, where you go down the rabbit hole of a surfing campaign, as it were, and you can't always go back the way that you got to where you're at. You can't trace it all the time. And in a book, you can always go back to where you were before. So the notion of durability is one of the hallmark features of reading books, is that they're
Sure.
always going to be there. They're always going to be the same. And, but you don't ever really remember web searching.
No.
Don't
No.
remember that. You got what
Well,
you
yeah.
wanted and you quit, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's part of that. It's part of that soundbite mean real phenomenon. And I think it began with web pages where you click it, you're in another place. You may not be able to get back where you were. And more likely than not, you're going to click something else and be in another place anyway. But
Yeah.
think about this just for a second, Eddie. Put a link in the middle of a paragraph. If the paragraph is the context for the link, then what happens when you click the link and you don't get the whole context that the paragraph was offering you? I mean, these things were written haphazardly, and at that particular time, I was writing them. I was a webmaster for a while, and I really had to think about how I did that. And it was easy to see how other people didn't, and
Yeah.
so I'm
Yeah.
kind of off on another thing here, but books have a kind of durability and a sort of, they're an attempt at completeness.
Okay. Yeah. That's what I was thinking about there, because with the internet, let's take for into consideration what the internet is. I love the internet, but I have never walked away. I'm 44 years old. I've never walked away from an internet session going, man, I feel really fulfilled. I feel recreated. I feel more energetic. I'm usually like, oh, okay. Like,
Yeah.
I feel a little less. I might know what I was searching for. I might have found the information. I probably did, but I feel a little less. When I read a book, if I sit down, it usually takes me about 15 minutes. But if I spend 15 minutes with a book, I usually feel a little more, right? A little more human, a little more calm, a little more centered. Let's take into consideration the difference. While I love that the internet has allowed everybody to have a voice and to be an author, not everybody is a great writer, right? And not everybody is editing their writing so that it is presented well. But a book, if it's traditionally published, has gone through a great writing talent.
Right.
It's gone through several layers of editing. Then it's sat. Then it's been edited again, and then again before it's published. Usually, you are being exposed to a very high level of English language and conversation and thought.
Right.
And the ideas are presented in a logical way that you walk away going, that was a great story. That was really good. What you don't see is all the effort that went into making that thing.
Right.
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 And I wanted to read you a quick passage real quick. We've been talking about Stephen King. This is Stephen King's book on writing. I love this book.
Uh-huh.
But he says, hey, grab that book you were looking at on the shelf again, would you? The weight of it in your hands tells you other stuff that you can take in without reading a single word. The book's length, naturally, but more. The commitment the writer shouldered in order to create the work. The commitment constant reader must make to digesting it. So King is making an argument here that, like, I mean, the size isn't always an indication of value or goodness, but the quality of the writing, the quality of the research behind the writing, does it have footnotes in the back? Is it well thought out? Does it have a little meat to it? Look, a lot of effort went into this thinking. And if you want to be a better thinker, you can't skim this. You can't read the blurb on the internet. You've got to put in an equal amount of effort. You could be with this thing for quite a while. And I think the moment that you accept that, like, I'm gonna really read this book. I'm not gonna read it to say I read it. I'm gonna read it. The moment you make that decision, the book changes. At least it does for me. I don't know what you think about that.
I think that's right. And, I think it would be fair to say that no reader spends more time with a book than the writer does producing it. But an internet product, like a website, for instance, or a meme or a reel, I mean, impossible really to conclude that those kinds of products would receive the same care that an author would give to a book, because the whole idea is to get it out there. The whole idea is to make this available, not to make it good, not to make it useful even, but to make it available. It's sort of like, your purpose is to stay there, not it's not supposed to last.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. People writing today are doing it to be front of mind because everybody else is shouting to be front of mind, right?
Right.
Here's a fun example. There's an essay by one of my favorite writers, Henry David Thoreau. He wrote, I don't know how long the essay is off the top of my head. It's called Walking.
Mm-hmm.
It's an essay on walking. Like, nobody's going to write an essay on walking today, and nobody's going to read it. Like, are you serious? Walking is such a benign thing. But we read it at my book club, and people were floored. They were floored at how good it was. We had some of the richest discussion ever on walking. And it's because Thoreau put effort into that essay, and he made a really clear argument that made us think. And it was just lovely, right? That's the difference between reading something that an author has put some effort into and is making a clear argument versus somebody who's shouting on the internet, don't forget me, don't forget me, don't forget me. I'm right here. Yeah. So, yeah. Okay. This has been great so far. So, what are some of the, you mentioned that yes, it became about the 52 books. What were some of the positives that came out of sitting down and trying to stick with this goal for that long?
Well, I never would have read that many new writers, I don't think.
Yeah, that's helpful.
It brought me out of that comfort zone of reading what I'm used to.
Mm-hmm.
And like I said, that Julian Barnes, I liked his books. I thought they were really, really good books. And I read Silence by Don DeLillo, and that was a wild book and a very short book, but it was an interesting book. I never would have read him. I read The Alchemist, and I didn't care for it. But
yeah, you didn't like it.
I wouldn't have read it otherwise. If I hadn't had the imperative to keep going, I might not have read it.
Mm.
But I read it because it wasn't very long, and it was popular in schools here. So I had another motive for that. I read it so that I could talk to my students about it because they may have read it in school at some point in time.
Yeah.
And I know my daughters read it or had it assigned, but again, it's a book I might not have gotten to or thought about if I hadn't needed to fill the next gap. So the pressure, I guess you could use, say, the pressure to get another book would lead me to read some books that I might not have read before. I read some new Irish fiction, and my dissertation director, who's a Facebook friend, said, "Oh yeah, I've been reading that too. That's really good stuff." And there was, I might not have ever had that little conversation if I hadn't read that book, because again, I kind of stay in the things I'm comfortable with. And um, I think
That's a,
pushing me into those new areas was helpful. I think that was something, and to see how newer books are done, I mean,
yeah.
that was useful. That was beneficial, I think.
Okay, so that's actually a good point. When you're trying to consume a lot of books, you end up in spaces you wouldn't normally play in. There's a lot of value to that, right? Because you're exposed to different cultures, different ways of thinking. And I love that you're sort of admitting that you usually would read what you would, you play in your lane. And I think we all do that and we don't realize it, right? Um, I've been trying really hard this year to do that as well, to try and open myself up to different books. Which, for example, led me to Unveiled by Yasmin Mohammed, which was a book that just completely blew my mind. It's her story of being raised in an Islamic family and sort of the horror that she experienced from that sort of religious tyranny that, I would have never read that. It's just not even in my wheelhouse. So I think one thing we can do as readers is to be honest with the books we're reading and realize that you do tend to pick a lane, and there are hundreds of lanes, right? So
Right.
that's good. Um, what would you say are some of the bigger cons that came out of the goal? We talked about it being just about the number, but were there any other cons that came out of this?
I don't think that a year from now, it's doubtful how much I'll remember from most of these books.
Yeah,
And again, I can say I did it sort of thing, but that's not the same as reading a book because you want to get something from it.
yeah,
Um, and I think that the overall experience was a little bit empty, just because that's not the way I do it. Right.
yeah,
And
yeah.
this idea that, I was sort of responding to what someone else did. And of course,
Ooh.
I don't have any real idea what kind of books she read. I assume most of them were rock and roll biographies, which isn't quite the same as taking on John Dewey, right? I mean,
Yeah,
I think that the format of the book, like if it's really easy to sort of glance at and get, that's different from trying to squeeze, the Martian Chronicles in, which I found terrible. Actually,
I don't like I
like it
love Ray Bradbury. Martian Chronicles just doesn't do it for me.
because
Yeah,
Fahrenheit 451 is one of the
yeah,
best books ever,
sure.
But
Yeah, I'm
I
with
didn't
you.
like Martian Chronicles. I didn't like it.
Didn't
I
it?
read All Quiet on the Western Front. That was a really good book. I really loved
Sure.
that. And then I would go watch the movies. So I did watch some good movies because I would watch the movies of the books that I was reading,
Yeah,
if they were out there, and a lot of them were.
that's
Um,
always fun to do.
I read a nice book called Our Souls at Night, which is a movie with Jane Fonda and Robert Redford. And
Okay.
it's about two elderly people that just talk to each other.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, that's a thought that I didn't. I mean, it's not a book I probably would have chosen otherwise, but it was
Yeah.
on the this is a really short book to read list. So, and I just
Okay.
I'm coming out. I'm coming
Yeah.
out. I'm confessing. I just used Google. I just Googled short books for adults, and I read the list. And a lot of the books on my list were on those lists.
Okay,
So,
people. This is
I
how it
just
happens.
I just dived into that with, if 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 I was breaking the boundaries, I'm breaking them, I'm shattering them, I'm running through them. So
That's
I just
funny.
Googled short books for adults, but again, I might not have ever read any of them if I
Yeah.
hadn't done. So as an experiment, it's got some value. As an
Yeah.
experiment of my reading habits, of the things that I respond to, of what a newer book looks like. I read a lot of books by women authors that
Good.
I almost
Look,
certainly wouldn't have probably tried
good.
um, otherwise. And some of those were really interesting and were about women's issues. There's a really interesting one called The Lost Wife,
Uh-huh.
which was about a woman trying to make the best life for she and her daughter during the Civil War era, and all the sort of difficulties that she faced going from one place to another, and so on. It's a really interesting book,
Mm.
and I probably wouldn't have known about it because, you know, again, I would probably be reading Plato or
Yeah.
Dante, or
Yeah.
rereading Plato or Dante, or
Yeah.
something like that. So
Yeah, I love that. I love that it has sort of opened you up and given you a chance to experience other authors. And maybe there is an argument for doing sort of a blitz read just to try and get a sense of styles and people and stuff, because that does, you do need to get shaken up at times. And
yeah,
I think this is a strategy. Another strategy for that is to join book clubs that are sort of thematic that you wouldn't normally attend to. Like my book club, for example, it is both fiction and nonfiction, but everything we read has a philosophical question baked into it. So Flowers for Algernon is a great concept there, right? Like this book is
yes,
very philosophical, even though it's a story. Yeah, it's so good. Um, but there are book clubs that are just, they only read romance. There are book clubs that only read historical, whatever. That's another way to do it. So I think that's really valuable to be shown that there are other types of literature out there. One of the things that I did is I took a course in English. I'm actually in it right now. It's American Lit, but the whole point of the course, the one I chose, is um, um, marginalized authors, marginalized
yeah,
voices,
mm-hmm.
and it's been great because like in my head, I've always just known that American authors were Ralph Waldo Emerson,
Yeah,
Walt Whitman, Henry David Thoreau, right? They're all the old wise white guys, and that's just what we've all been grown up on. But all of a sudden, when you're exposed to other writers like Frederick Douglass and all of these things, you're like, it opens up, right? And you realize that there are just so many great voices out there, and you become hungry for them, and then you realize that there are a lot of stories that that I need to hear that are good for me as a person. So I love that, but I also like how you pointed out that one of the downsides was that you probably won't remember a lot of this. That retention is maybe not going to be there.
yeah. The
Does that?
accomplishment becomes saying you finished it.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
really not right. That's really not right. That's
No, it's
really
not.
not the right thing to do. Incidentally, I taught Frederick
Mhm.
Douglass about a year ago. I taught
Great
the
book.
narrative of Frederick Douglass in a freshman class, and man,
Yep,
yeah, talk about.
it's one of my favorites.
I
Yeah,
mean, it really does. It's about identity more than anything else, and self awareness, and what it
one
gets.
education.
Is
Yeah,
really interesting. What it gets at is really something, and then we trace the trajectory of Frederick Douglass and how it manifests. In Martin Luther King over here and Malcolm X over there, and that sort of trajectory of thought, and that was our whole semester. Really, was writing about those kinds of things. But the students loved that book. They really loved it, and we tried Confucius, and they didn't like that. It's cryptic in ways, and I tried to give them the background and those kinds of things, and it didn't really get to them. But Frederick Douglass was a really big candidate, and um,
well, the nice thing about Frederick Douglass is his story is universal. Not only is it about slavery, but it's about the value of educating yourself and what happens when you do. Because he took responsibility for his own education,
right,
and that allowed him to find his way to freedom. I mean, the metaphor there, not only the historical fact, but if you educate yourself, you are no longer a slave. Right?
right,
Is a
right,
really powerful metaphor, and I love how he did it too. I mean, he was very very cunning in trying to get educated, because back then it was illegal to educate slaves.
right,
You
right. So
weren't
he would
allowed to
trick
do it.
people into teaching him things. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
yes,
He had games that he would play with kids on the street, and he would get them to teach him the letters of the alphabet, and very smart guy. And I love how he went from complete lack of education to one of the best orators our country has seen. I mean, that's an impressive feat, you know?
Certainly is. And
Yeah.
the reason that he did it right was that, I'm going to manifest literacy
Mm-hmm.
so that other people can see how valuable it really is. And
Yeah.
that's a great motive and a great moment. And um, but
Yeah, I
that
agree.
was a good book to teach. It was a really good book to teach.
Well, let's bring this full circle before we wrap up today. So you started a challenge for yourself, 52 books over the course of a year. Some good came out of that. You were exposed to authors you wouldn't normally have read, but some bad came out of it too, where you found yourself sort of hacking the system, Googling short books for adults and how do I get through this quickly and hit my goal. And also the retention probably isn't going to stick around for much of this. So at the end, it really is, you're able to say, well, I did it. I read 52 books, but maybe didn't get as much out of it as you wanted. Now, this isn't to say that reading 52 books a year is bad. It just depends on where you're at in life and how much time you have. Some people, not me, but some people could probably read 100 books a year and read them really well because that's all they do. They have no kids, they're retired, they're not nothing, and they just read and write and take notes. You maybe could read 100 books a year and have it be a meaningful experience, right? For me, where I'm at, I've probably got 10 really deep reads a year in my life. And then I've got some fun stuff that I'll listen to on podcasts and my book clubs. I'll probably do about 20 books a year, but 10 of them I'm really deeply into taking thick notes on. And that's very meaningful for me. And that's okay. Like, I'm proud to say I read 10 books a year, but I read them really well. And I think we just need to know where you're at in life. Is that fair? Like,
Yeah,
let's not
sure.
worry so much about the number. Let's just know what you can and can't do. And the moment you feel anxiety or guilt, you're probably misaligned a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's probably the litmus test, isn't it?
I think so. I do think so.
Yeah.
And I wrote a little review on Facebook of each one.
Oh, did you?
I shared this whole thing on my Facebook page. And
Nice.
every time I finished a book, I would write a little review as a status. And this number of books in number 2024, I had a whole sort of process that I had for that. So that if I do want to know something, I can go back and look at least at that little
love
blurb.
that.
But even writing a meaningful blurb became something that wasn't really available because I had to read the next book,
Yeah.
And so I do think I learned a lot about my reading processes from this, but I'm not sure I'd do it again. I don't think I would ever try to do it again.
If somebody were wanting to set a reading goal for themselves, now that you've been through this, what guidance would you give them?
Well, I think I would suggest that they think about what they want to know and then get a book that can answer that question. So the motive should be, as you said earlier, you're a little bigger when you're done with the book, right? And that should be the outcome, is that you learn something that you didn't know, or you put yourself in somebody else's universe and you experience another lifestyle or another place or another era, rather than just, this is kind of what's on the New York Times bestseller list. I think that the outcome-based approach would be useful, would be good, because it makes you think about what you want to know. And that's a huge question. That's a huge question. And the books can help you answer that question, right?
Yeah.
I also think that it's a good thing to read all the time. It's not necessarily a good thing to read as fast as you can. And again, I do feel a kind of uneasiness about claiming these books because, I read them but that's all I got.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways, that's all I have. And again, some of them resonated a lot. The Willa Cather was really, I was supposed to have read it when I was a kid because I grew up in Nebraska and she's what we got.
Yeah.
And it took all this time to get that. And I read another one that was Then, This Is Now.
Oh,
I was assigned that book in school and never read it. I've actually gone back and read all the books that I didn't read in school that I was supposed to read. So, read Badge of Courage. Finally read that about 10 years ago. And so my middle school English teacher would be proud of me for that. But,
That's funny.
and I read some things that were interesting to me, like A River Runs Through It. I was very careful with that book because I wanted to see how the book and the movie were different. I was very careful with All Quiet on the Western Front because I wanted to see, and it goes into a lot of things that the movie couldn't touch, and I really like that. I read The House on Mango Street, which has been suggested to me over and over and over again. So I did work in a couple of books that had always sort of been hanging out there in the ether, and I finally read some of those books. And I never read Louise Erdrich, and so I was glad to finally read some of those books and see, what her project is. And they were magnificent books, but like I said, it's hard to talk about, but some of the things that she writes about in those are coincident with my experience as a younger person. And she was right on.
Yeah, she connects. Yeah.
So,
well, I think those are good tips, and I would suggest with reading, because everybody, I think we all feel pretty overwhelmed right now with work and responsibility in life. What if we tried this, everybody? What if instead of saying, let's read 100 books this year, what if your goal was, I'm going to read one book this year really well? Anything above that is gravy, but I'm going to pick one book I've always wanted to read, but I'm not just going to read it. I'm going to do a little homework around it as well. I'm going to learn about the author. If I can, I'll go to the location where it was written. I'll whatever. Like, for example, I just went to Boston and I went to Walden Pond. So if you like Walden by Thoreau, it's one of my favorite books. So not everybody can do this, but I had a work conference there, so I rented a car and drove to Walden. So that ability to be where the book was written, to walk the same trails Thoreau walked, to go to the cabin, to see his writing desk, made that book more special to me. It made it more meaningful, made it more special. And but what if you read just one book this year? And what if today you sat down and just took a pen and paper and wrote, if I could only read one book this year, but read it well, what book would that be and why? And see if you can write for 3 pages. Just do a little morning pages session like Julia Cameron would ask you to do with The Artist's Way. Just write subconsciously and see what comes out. See if you can identify one book that you've always wanted to read and why. And then commit to reading that over the course of the next 12 months really, really well. Anything else you read above that? Fantastic. But how different will your life be in 12 months when you've completely embraced that book? How will it have changed you? How will it have made a difference in your life, and so on? I think that'd be a fun exercise for people.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
It's a really good idea. It's really good thinking.
Yeah. Well, excellent. Any last thoughts before we wrap up? I know we're close to the hour here.
Well, I've had a thought. It comes out from the hiking experience, actually. But last December, I did a fundraiser, and it was like 100 miles in December. And actually, it was go 100 miles. It wasn't fake 100 miles. You could ride a bike, you could run, you could count your steps during the day. It was they wanted as it progressed, people would start one-upping each other, and and the underlying theme was that not all steps are equal, right? And that if you're taking all these steps from your kitchen to your living room, that's not the same thing as, I'm out here running 15 miles today. And that's all true enough. But the fact is that every step is 100% more than not taking a step. And reading one book is 100% more than not reading at all. Right? So, and that's been around since December of last year.
Yeah.
And I'm getting everything I need out of my hikes. I get, every time I go, I split the uprights on my annual physical. It's doing everything it's supposed to do. I mean, I get all these. I'm out of town. I'm away from people. I don't have any noise. I don't ever take music or anything like that. I always just live in that moment, like Thoreau kind of was doing in walking, right? And so I think one of the things that I got from this exercise, we'll call it an exercise, is that it ended up, instead of being a charge forward, it ended up being a step back. And I do think I really, really examined what it means to me to read a book, what it doesn't mean, right? What reading a book isn't. I think sometimes you have to, like Arthur C. Clarke said, I think it was Arthur C. Clarke, that you got to go back a little bit into the impossible before the possible makes sense to you. And I think I got a taste of that with this mania I've engaged in over the last 9 months here. And it was, in some ways, it felt manic. Yeah. Because the motive was to get done, not to do something. You see what I'm saying?
100%. Yeah. When I'm reading a book, and I've made a few podcast episodes about this, the moment that you're getting through the book, I always quote that. I've got to get through this book. It's now just a chore on a to-do list.
Right.
It's just another thing. It's like sweeping the floor, doing the dishes, getting the kid to karate, right? Finish the book.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Yeah. And the moment that you get there, you either are in the wrong book, or you've got to slow down and reconnect with why this book matters. Books should never be gotten through. It should never be a to-do list item, right?
Yeah. If it becomes a chore, you're missing the point.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's one of the things I learned from this.
Yeah. The last thing I'd like to say today is, and I've shared this with people before too, but let's pretend you're reading the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, right? We've been talking about that one today. Well, if Frederick Douglass were to walk into your house at night, right, and sit down at your dinner table and share with you his story, would you be like, come on, Mr. Douglass, get through this. I got stuff to do, right? What? Like, can you give me the blurb version? Give me the internet version, because I got a lot to... No, you'd be like, this, oh my gosh. Like, you would sit down and you would turn the radio off, and you would have your kids sit next to you and pay attention, and you would like really be involved in this guy's conversation, right? That's what reading is, you guys. It should be that. It should be letting Frederick Douglass or whoever you're reading, Jane Austen, whatever, she's sitting at your table, right? And that's what the book should be. And if it's anything other than that, first of all, be kind to yourself and know that your internet brain's just going. You've just been programmed to be fast. Be kind to yourself. Don't get mad and give up, but just reset and slow down again. Just reset and slow down again. And keep doing that. And eventually your brain will give in and become a good reader. And that's what we're doing here. And so I loved this conversation today. I think setting reading goals is a positive thing. And I think, but trying to set a goal that is very, very attainable and keeps you in reading for the purpose of reading, not to say you have read, right? Is a big deal. Yeah. To get
Life
something out of
avails, not the having lived. That's what Emerson said.
Yeah, so, absolutely.
Reading only avails, not the having read.
Yeah, you're a music guy, and in fact, that this book "Flow" by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. I don't know if you've read this one. This is a good book. I haven't. It's about the process of being in flow. When everything's just working and you are at your best, and nothing can stop you. So he did a bunch of research around how do you get into that state, and how do you stay in that state more often versus just having it happen haphazardly. And he talks about listening to music in there and listening to concertos or whatever. And he said it's not about playing the music on your radio. It's about listening to the music as it's playing, and sort of that concept of like, it's not enough to have the music on. in your house. You need to actively listen to it, and then your brain makes the higher connection, right? It's the same with the book. It's not about quickly reading the pages and getting through it. It's about reading the book.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So, yeah. Well, great. Dr. Jacobsen, thank you so much for spending some time with us again today.
Certainly.
I love our conversations. Your insight is always a lot of fun, and your sort of approach to being willing to experiment with what it means to be a reader has been really fun too. I love that you're actively trying to figure out how to get better at this skill. So, well, thank you for sharing the journey with us and for being super honest. I think that's really helpful for people who are in similar goals and feel the shame and the guilt of not being able to hit this goal. And so that's very helpful. Well, I hope you all got something out of that this week. I really appreciate the guests that come on to the show. And again, just take time to connect with the books that you love. And as always, remember to read slowly, take notes, and apply the ideas. We'll see you all next time.